Welcome to Talent Freaks with Andy Coon. I'm Andy, a filmmaker and photographer based in the Bay Area of California, and I'm thrilled to share conversations that explore creativity, passion, and the stories that inspire us all. In this episode, we are revisiting a conversation from 2007 with Adam Zucker. He's a filmmaker dedicated to exploring stories of culture, identity, and resilience. Before we dive in, if you could do me a favor, I'd love for you to subscribe and rate Talent Freaks on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps others discover these stories and keeps the creativity flowing. So let's jump back in time in 2007 and let the younger version of me introduce Adam and into this episode of Talent Freaks. This week I sat down with film director Adam Zucker. Adam Zucker is an independent filmmaker and editor whose work has been seen extensively in theatrical documentaries on PBS, HBO, NBC, and other networks. Greensboro Closer to the Truth is his first independently produced feature documentary, which premiered at the 2007 South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. And it premiered in Greensboro on April 19th, 2007, downtown at the Carolina Theater. And that is where I saw Closer to the Truth, was down at the Carolina Theater. I was very impressed with his presentation about November 3rd, 1979. I approached him afterwards and I asked him if he would be up for a podcast, and he agreed, which I thought would be a very interesting conversation between him and myself, since I did Greensboro's Child and I have a really good understanding of the material that he went through, but also because I also want to learn more about being an independent filmmaker such as himself, where he went out, got grants, and he did a really good job representing himself by the artistic creation. And he has an amazing background which helped him put together this documentary. So sit back, relax, and if you're a beginning filmmaker or into documentaries and want to learn how to do it, get into the minds of two independent filmmakers. And I really did learn a lot from him. So thanks, Adam Zucker. So here we go, conversation with Adam Zucker. Thank you, Adam Zucker, for stopping by my house and conducting this interview called Conversations with Coon. And one of the things that I'm really glad that you and I could talk about is both of us have a very good understanding of what took place November 3rd, 1979, and also the people involved and the city itself. You had a premiere of your documentary, Greensboro Closer to the Truth, Thursday night at the Carolina Theater, and I've never seen the Carolina Theater so packed and very they were very responsive to your documentary, and I felt like it was overwhelming, a very good showing. How did you feel about your screening in Greensboro?
Well, I had a lot of anxiety about it ahead of time of showing the film in Greensboro. I have been showing it in public, and I've gotten a little used to that, but I feared. I guess what I had in mind as a fear was the concept of myself as a carpetbagger, someone coming down and judging this city and these people and painting it in broad strokes. And I think there was something like 300 to 400 people at the Carolina Theater. I thought it was very responsive, and there was a very energetic and involved Q&A, which went on for quite some time, which people seemed to need, which I was really happy about. A certain part of me, and I kind of removed myself from the egotism of, oh, I made a great film and everybody should want to see it. And it's really not on that level. But one would think if there was a documentary made about a place that's a serious and kind of well-regarded and accepted documentary in professional circles, that's all about two of the more controversial things that have ever happened in the city, that people would actually be interested to come and see it. That it's not just another news report. And honestly, the way it strikes me is that more people didn't come, and that it wasn't a full theater is sort of indicative of what the film is about, which is that many people in Greensboro want no part of this and aren't interested in what went on and in trying to examine what occurred, why it occurred, how it occurred, all that. But having said that, it's not a numbers game, and I really do end up feeling that if a handful of people, and it was certainly more than a handful, really get to see something they didn't know and get to learn something, then that's a really positive thing. So I approached it with a fair amount of anxiety. I had a splitting headache all day, but I was really happy with how the screening went.
That's good. They had one of the biggest things that it's very frustrating in Greensboro to be a backer of the Truth Commission or of the social justice that you think that these people deserve, how people do tune them out and don't want to know anything else besides what they already know. Uh, but from the screenings that I did, which very few people showed up also, it was interesting though, because the people that were there were very responsive, and they also wanted to take it to schools. They wanted to show people at churches. And that's where it really has to start, like, branching out, and for other people to kind of like go, oh, what's this? Because everything else, like, the far as the news is concerned, the newspapers, they get their information there and they feel satisfied with it without going a little bit deeper, unless somebody, one of their friends, brings it up or shows it at school or at the library. So it's really tough in this town to get people to listen to it, because they've already made up their mind. For the past 30 years, somebody's been telling them what to think about this process.
People are fairly entrenched in Greensboro, and I always try to couch it that it's not just Greensboro, and it's possibly, if this story took place in Chicago,
True.
which has a larger population base, of course, that a lot of people would be very entrenched in their mindset also. I find two things take place. One is I do show it, have been, and will be to a great degree outside of Greensboro entirely. I premiered it in Austin, Texas. I've certainly shown it up in New York. And I have many more screenings coming up. And I do find that people who know nothing about the city of Greensboro, nothing about what happened in 1979, and really nothing about this effort, this truth and reconciliation effort, are startled by the film and really want to know more and are really engaged in it. And how it operates outside of Guilford County in North Carolina proper and inside are two different things.
You're absolutely right.
And when making the film, it's funny because I got funding, for which I'm very grateful, from the Sundance Documentary Fund, and which opens up a lot of doors besides being a lot of money, which helped tremendously with the making of the film. And I bring that up because through Sundance, I did a number of screenings as it was in progress, and people would always introduce it as this important film. And I didn't really set out to make a quote-unquote important film that would change people's minds about things or inform them about something important. I set out to make a story about people whose work I really admired and who had evolved over a period of time, and on a human character level I was really interested in. And the goal of having something that would really change the world, so to speak, that wasn't on my mind at all consciously. But now that it's done, and I see it can have impact in a couple of ways. One is traveling the country, either with the film on its own or with me, and people seeing it and learning something about what went on in Greensboro that they knew nothing about, that might hopefully inspire them a little bit. But also in North Carolina, in Guilford County, around the Southeast, where I think it can have a real impact. Not so much so that another community would want to have a truth commission, but just that people can understand that they can, in fact, deal with things that happened in the past, which aren't very pretty, and that they can, in fact, not take justice into their own hands. That's kind of vigilante justice,
Right.
But take democracy into their own hands. And on that level, on a much smaller scope, if showing it to a group of 50 people, if it can inspire them in some way, then that would make me feel terrific. And I hadn't really had that in mind while making it, but now that it's beginning to be seen, I'm kind of beginning to get an inkling of what the potential is.
And that's one thing about the Truth Commission, that people, like you said, around the country don't realize that these were actually, popped up and being made and are strictly by the people. They have no association with any government ties whatsoever. And it's very empowering to know that it's out there, and people can come together and do their own actions in order to come up with something that powerful. And of course, you're going to have your people that don't think it's valid at all. And that's the one thing I liked about your documentary, is because I know the characters involved, especially Nelson Johnson and Willena Cannon, and you really did portray a side of them that I couldn't, and that was a very personal, and also you saw the growth of how they matured through life and their passion for what they believe in. And it just really paints them as just really decent people who really want good things for everybody. And I came away from it feeling refreshed and, happy about that group of people.
Well, that was definitely the motivating force was how to make, because I was I admired Nelson and Molina and other folks a great deal and wanted to try to convey that in some way. To make a film about people and how they change and have evolved over 25 years or after a 25-year period, you really have to get to the core of who they are and have to convey that in some way to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that was difficult to do in as much as Nelson Johnson, who I do have a great deal of admiration for, has gotten some terrible press, and he knows that, and has been seen very poorly in films. And I think he's very careful. And I do, as much as a documentary filmmaker, you want someone who's just a loose cannon who's going to say all kinds of things, and then you can just easily paint them in all kinds of easy ways. I respect someone who's very, who has some sense of how they come across,
Right.
and has some sense of wanting to control a situation. I respect it, but it makes my job a lot harder. Nelson Johnson, who I wouldn't call him a friend, but I think we have a very good relationship,
Mm-hmm.
off camera is a very warm person and very funny and very personable. And as soon as the camera goes on, I think he's very conscious of how he comes across. And I do respect that. No one wants to make a movie about me, but I'm definitely that same way.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone did, they would get very frustrated because I'd just be conscious of how I could be misinterpreted and recontexted and all those things. And it took a lot of time of my being around before I think Nelson specifically trusted me to the point where he would kind of let his hair down, so to speak. The other thing about the Truth Commission, going back to the other thing you said, is that the fact that it does not have a government affiliation, in some sense, was a real impediment to the word getting out there. That's my take, is that because, and I know this from a couple of newspapers that I spoke to, larger papers outside of this area, and they said, well, they have no credibility. Who are they? Why should we write about this? Whereas the commission that was set up to examine the Wilmington race riots
Right.
was mentioned in the New York Times editorial pages. There were articles about it because the Congress of, or the state legislature legislated it and ordained it. Yet, I'm not really a radical or an activist. I'm not at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that there comes a time when you can't wait for government to do things and you have to do it yourself.
I agree.
So I think the word is empowering. It is very empowering that people can take something on their own. And it probably works better on a small scale than on a large scale. And the irony, perhaps, is that change in Greensboro, or the impact of the Truth Commission, will probably take a lot longer here in Greensboro than it will in other places. But I do think it'll have a long-term ripple effect. And it might take a long time. But for any of the commissioners or for the people who brought this about, I thought, it was all in vain because no one was paying attention. That kind of impact does take time. It doesn't happen instantly.
Yeah.
And I hope in time that it will all really have the impact that it deserves.
And as you're an insider, so you've seen other communities look at the Truth Commission as a light of hope and a guidance, because Brown University, they look to them to help them reveal their recommendations for their slavery report, where they found that Brown had ties to slavery. And also, it's so nice to know that they didn't. You're right about the government situation. They asked for it. They asked the city council, and they turned them down. So it was just like, all right, well, you're not gonna support us. And they didn't ask for any money. They just wanted their support and listen to their recommendations. They didn't say, we're gonna give you recommendations. You need to make these solid. They asked to listen to them, and they flat out refused. And I know Keith Holliday was very careful in his words. Like, he didn't want that to go down at all. But it happened. And, of course, being in Greensboro, I see a lot of things that a lot of people try to discredit the Truth Commission because Nelson had a stake in the process, the beginning process. He was part of the whole thing, like, in general. He was talking to everybody throughout the whole thing. But that shouldn't take away their hard work and what they went through, because they went through all the evidence. They went through all these people that came in to interview, to reveal how the impact of November 3rd did on their lives, and then they came to this conclusion. And a lot of people didn't like it around here. So, but yeah, you're right. Other people outside are going to look at this report and go, wow, we could do that here too. And until that starts spreading out there, I think that's when Greensboro will finally understand the significance of the Truth Commission to Greensboro.
Yeah, it's easy to paint Greensboro. I mean, there is the book, and someone referenced it last week in Durham at the screening, William Chafee's book, Civilities and Civil Liberties, which is a very well done book that points to the paradox of Greensboro, that it's a place that likes to say it's very progressive and all the reasons why it's not. And I would suggest that Greensboro isn't really that special or that distinct. Um, I can imagine, I understand why a lot of places, a lot of communities would not really want to advertise terrible things that happened in the past. And
Right.
there's the whole litany of excuses of, well, these people who were killed were not from here. The people
Hmm.
who started this, they were not from there. Well, what does that have to do with anything? It happened here, and nobody wanted it to happen here, but it did.
Hmm.
So it doesn't matter where they were from. No matter how you cut it, 5 people were killed in the streets of Greensboro in broad daylight, and the police weren't there. And I understand that that doesn't reflect well upon the city in 1979. And one of the arguments that I heard from people, including Keith Holliday, particularly Keith Holliday, who was very careful to say to me, and I've heard him say otherwise, that had he been on the jury in 1979, from what he knows, he would have found somebody guilty. But it happened. There was a court of law. It's all yesterday's news, and it's important to move forward, and nothing will bring these people back, so there's nothing to be gained by examining this. And that it's bad for business, and it's bad for the reputation of Greensboro, and his job is to bring businesses into Greensboro, and this will hurt it. I just don't buy that.
I
And
don't either.
I think I'm not a multinational corporation, and I'm not someone who's looking for a new community to move to. But I sincerely think that if I were interested in coming to Greensboro, the fact that something really bad happened here 27 years ago, and that the city now is willing to open itself up and to really examine and
Hmm.
explore it, that would make a big impression upon me in a positive light. It wouldn't be in a negative light. I think to be able to say something happened here, we're terribly sorry it happened, we weren't really involved, but we're going to try to find out why this happened, and we're going to try to do what we can. Can't bring people back to life, but to make the victims and the survivors feel better about it. I think that's a very positive thing, and I just don't. I don't buy, and I don't agree with the concept that ultimately it's better to sweep it under the rug.
I agree 100% with you. And but going back with Keith Holliday's mindset, he's a mayor of Greensboro who's also in banking. That's his career. So he thinks on a very professional, capitalist mindset about business and what's best for a community. And I understand this because some people I know who work or who are CEOs have they've told me what good was my documentary, and like, have you made any money off it or anything else? I'm like, that's not the point. I mean, Christ, I did this when I was working at pizza. I was delivering pizzas, so it was it's well thought. I mean, that's a mindset of typical business people. So I can understand why he would say that, but like you, I agree. If I saw a community tackling those issues and trying to bring it out and talk about it, that's such a welcoming to so many, like the citizens. I don't know about businesses, but as far as the citizens are concerned, that's a great place to go because you're like, you feel good. You could go there. You could talk about a lot of different things, and that's a progressive government or a place that's very progressive.
Right. I mean, I can't really pretend to understand what it's like to be the mayor of a not small city. It is a
Right.
quarter of a million people roughly, and it's a big job. And Mayor Holliday was happy to talk to me, and he did spend a great deal of time with me. And I have seen him on the streets from time to time, he would stop and talk to me as long as I agreed not to, pester him about the Truth Commission, which I wasn't interested in doing.
Right.
And but ultimately, having said that, one can't help but think, at least as he comes across in my film, like he's kind of scrambling to find a very delicate position on a precarious hill, which he can safely say that he sort of supports the effort, but he's not officially endorsing it. And his splitting of hairs in order to say that, I find a little questionable.
Mm.
Um, but again, it's for me as a New Yorker, it's not a question of condemning Greensboro or
Right.
condemning any of these individuals. I think one could easily make a similar film about other places. And ironically, being here at the River Run Film Festival, which is based in Winston-Salem, where the trials of Darrell Hunt by Ricky Stern and Andy Sundberg explores a not a similar case, but a case of a young black man who was jailed for many years for a crime he didn't commit. It does not reflect very well upon the city of Winston-Salem at all. But at the same time, I spoke to the mayor of Winston-Salem the other day, and they did, in fact, they have been screenings of the film. They did talk with the filmmakers in terms of putting a postscript on the film, in terms of how the city did interact with this case over time eventually. And, one way or another, the truth is going to come out.
Absolutely.
And that's on a national scale and a local scale. And, time and again in political scandals, people try to put a cap on it, but it never works. It just never works. So you might as well just embrace it and go with it.
Get it over with and make sure people, understand it. But one of the things I want to talk about also is how did, first of all, when did you start, and this is going back to your career, but when did you start getting into filmmaking?
I majored in filmmaking in college at a state university in New York. I took
SUNY?
SUNY Binghamton. Okay. And I went there not knowing what I was going to do, and I ended up majoring in filmmaking and art. And the filmmaking department was run by a number of artists who were, at the time, what was called personal or experimental or avant-garde filmmakers. So that's I got a degree in avant-garde filmmaking, which enabled me to come to New York and make avant-garde films and never earn a penny for many, many years, and earn a living by doing outside jobs. And that whole world actually dried up for a variety of reasons. But between the end of the 70s and the mid 80s, or certainly by the end of the 80s, that whole world was just changing, and all the venues and collectives that I was involved in don't exist anymore, which is ironic. But many of those filmmakers went on to become music video directors or commercial directors, or got out of film, or became documentary filmmakers. But the short answer is, out of that, I became an editor because I needed to earn a living. And I did a lot of different kinds of editing at online facilities, worked on commercials, promos, television shows. But then I discovered documentaries, which in my college years I never really cared for, and became an editor of documentaries, which is really a great job. Being a filmmaker is a great job, but it's hard to make a living. Very, very hard to make a living as an independent documentary filmmaker. But as an independent documentary film editor, I definitely can make a living, and I get to work on a lot of terrific projects, and I don't have to raise the money. So
that's a good point.
It's a very good situation, and I expect to go back and forth. I'm about to start another edit job for the next year or so, and I can't spend all my time making films because there's just not the money to do it. I was fortunate enough to raise the money to make this film, but very little of that money went to me, which doesn't surprise me. So if I can go back and forth and edit a few films and then start another project of my own, I'd be pretty happy with that kind of model.
With this documentary, there's so much time in between shooting and different things. I know you had a lot of things to do with editing and trying to pre-produce everything else, but was there a time where you could take other outside jobs to, earn some pay during this?
I started shooting this film in November of 2003, and it was pretty much finished about 3 years later. But I spent maybe a year before that researching and raising money, so that's a 4-year period. Most of that time I was doing outside jobs, so which means I have 2 jobs. One is I'm editing, the other is I'm raising money, planning shoots, doing some of the kind of basic editing, not really intensive editing. And so that's difficult to do 2 things at once. But the time frame, the fact that the film does take a long time, and the fact that it takes a long time to raise the money to make the movie, those things are generally a real advantage and a plus. I read somewhere that the average length of time for an independent documentary is 7 years. So I beat that one.
Yeah.
But the reality is that I tell people that short of 10 years, once you get above 10 years, you got a problem. But generally, that means you're just having difficulties getting it together. But short of that, I mean, a 4 or 5 year period to make a film, the time is a plus. It's an advantage to allow things to take place in the story. If something is happening as you're filming it, or even if you're researching it, it gives you the time to kind of go off on side paths and sidebars that can in fact become the main story ultimately. So that's an advantage. It's an advantage to be editing it over time because then the editing has an opportunity to influence and impact the shooting and vice versa. And that's an advantage. And it's also an advantage to take a long time because you have an opportunity to develop the relationship with your characters.
Mm-hmm.
And had I swooped down and said, I'm going to do a 15-minute piece for 60 minutes, which in fact happened. They didn't ask me to do the piece, but they asked if I wanted. Someone found out I was making this film from 60 Minutes. They wanted to do a news piece on it. And did I want to be a consulting producer, which I chose not to be. The money wasn't really worth it in order to trade off my relationships.
Right.
But I introduced them to everybody and they chose to not do it. And I'm sure they would have done a reasonably good piece for a 15-minute or 12-minute, whatever it is. But by definition, it would have been sort of surface because I don't think you can really get to know people in a 2-week period. And whatever trust that I built up over a couple of years isn't going to happen over a couple of days or weeks. It just can't. So the beauty of documentary filmmaking is that it takes a really long time if you can use that to your advantage. And again, the only problem with that is that if you need to finish it in order to sell it, in order to pay yourself back or to earn back the expenses, that's a real pressure. I didn't have that pressure because I was able to raise the money to make the film.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I do sell it for television, all that money goes to me. It's not that much, all that money.
Right.
But whatever money I can earn goes back to me, and that's great. But that's a whole other model than people who make films on credit cards. And I know many people do. And honestly, I'm a little bit old to do that. I don't really do that anymore. And I'm not meaning, I know that you probably did not get a lot of funding for your film, Greensboro's Child.
Yeah, I didn't get any.
And it doesn't surprise me. And I'm not trying to say, oh, you should never make a film on credit cards.
Right.
But you shouldn't do it too many times.
I totally agree. And most of the stuff, equipment, recording right now is based on credit cards and still paying them. So, that's a wise thing to talk about. But you know what? If you're retired, you're late 80s, go for it. You know, if that's a dream, a passion of yours, let your kids worry about it. But one thing I wanted to ask about your editing, did that help you think as a director when you go out and shoot a documentary, since you had all that experience editing documentaries? Did that help you understand what to look for better than if you never edited documentaries?
Well, the editing of documentaries is really important because to some degree you're shaping the story in the edit room, and the challenge is how can you get the material that'll lend itself to that process. I've been very fortunate, and I've edited a lot of good projects, and I've gotten to work with a lot of really strong, experienced directors, all of whom I've learned a great deal from. And Barbara Koppel and Sidney Pollack and Ken Burns, more well-known names, but also Rory Kennedy and Madison Lacey and Liz Garbus and Michael Cantor and lots of people. And I've learned something from each one of those projects. And sometimes it's not what I would have expected to learn. And I had a lot to learn about shooting in the field. I've directed films before, but they are for television and kind of archival history films. And the only real directing was how to conduct an interview. And the only real producing was how to get a good rate on a rental or on buying footage. But to be in the field, so to speak, and try to figure there's this stuff going on here, what's my story? That was a lot to learn, and how to work with a cameraman and develop a relationship. So I did have a lot to learn. The telling of the story was very much informed by what I'd learned by editing other films. And what ironically, I have a good friend and editor, Richard Hankin, we've edited together, and I hired him to be my story editor on this film, someone who would watch it as it came together. He's an editor, and he too now makes his own films. And we joked once how it used to be that when I edited especially cinema verite films, and the director would come up on the stage after a screening and usually say thank you to Adam, and I'd say, why aren't I getting more of the credit? I edited this thing. I created it. And honestly, now that I've directed a film, I have a better understanding. It sounds very foolish to have said all that, but it's true that yes, a great deal goes on in the edit room, but if you don't have a vision and a real clear a clear idea of what the story might be, you end up with hundreds of hours of nothing. And you can do a lot in the edit room, but I've been involved in projects where there's hundreds and hundreds of hours and it just doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
And the challenge is how to have some sense of what the story is, but not be too rigid about it, to be open and flexible enough to new things that come up along the way. And sometimes the things that seem like they are those turnoff roads or the side tracks or the sidebars can become the heart of the film. And in my film, I guess one of those cases was Garl Pierce.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke to Garl Pierce, who was a former Grand Dragon of the Klan and a former Nazi, who appeared, I didn't really know who he was. He appeared at the Truth Commission, and he said these very wise, folky kinds of sayings. So he was very colorful, but kind of questionable at the same time.
Right.
And I went out to his house outside of Greensboro, or his brother's house, and we filmed there on a beautiful day. And he evoked a South that's now past in a way that was both filled of hatred and racism, but also very nostalgic.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't really being nostalgic for the racism. He really wasn't. But that setting, that background, that sense of the South as something that's changing, that was really becoming like everywhere else, is one of the important things to get about the film. And it was easy to see all his going on about the good old days,
Mm-hmm.
and how the Klan wasn't a dirty word back then, as just being really a sidestep and something that got in the way of the main story. But I really had a feeling that there was something at the heart of what he was saying. And it took a long time to fit that into a film in the way that it would work and that it wouldn't stand out like a sore thumb. So that doesn't have to do so much with working with other filmmakers as much as the concept of being aware that the story is a slippery fish and you got to hold on to it, and but you also have to be open to everything else that comes along the way. And if you grab for everything along the way, then you're not doing anything. But it's an elusive process.
And how did you get started? Because when I first got started with Greensboro's Child, the first thing I did was did a little research. But the first interview I did was with Lena Cannon. And then that just opened up a web of interviewees and directions that I wanted to go. And then I pretty much let it take me. So what was that first piece that really kind of spread you out?
Well, I knew that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the effort, had its own time frame. And it's a little premature at the beginning to say this is what the film is going to be like. But I knew since that would take place over a couple of years that could help lay the spine of the film. And the real challenge was knowing that in essence, what goes on at a place where people have meetings and talk and give lectures is sort of inherently boring, at least filmically, is how to utilize it and how to mine it without it kind of running the film into the ground. So I came down and just tried to capture some of the process and capture the moments that came on, and try to create situations where people would come together. And you know, when you're making a film but trying to fundraise for it, which is what most of us do, the difficulty is you're trying to shoot the story, but you're also all along the way trying to shoot for the trailer.
Right.
You're trying to get the footage so that you can make a 5-minute version that will be interesting to someone. And a 5-minute trailer is not the first 5 minutes of the film. It's something that's kind of punchy and grabs you and really makes you want to watch more. So I was trying to get both those things, but that's where editing while you're shooting is a really helpful thing, I think. And I almost always encourage people to do that. Obviously, it can't work if you're going to film a camel race in Saudi Arabia for 3 weeks.
Right.
You have to film it and then come back, and that's that. But in a story that's unfolding, and Greensboro's Child in its own way was unfolding, I think one of the dangers I've seen in other projects is people who shoot for 2 years and then they open their edit room. And even if you're not an editor, everyone has the equipment. You can just sketch out a scene. You can look at footage and actually cut some things together. And it will let you know if what you're filming is working, if the characters, in fact, work on the screen is the same way you thought they did when you were recording it. And the things that you uncover in editing really help to direct the remainder of the shooting. Being an editor, I had that advantage to be able to do that, but it really isn't it's a great resource to draw upon, and it can
Absolutely.
solve a lot of problems.
Especially like when I interviewed Jim Melvin, and then I went and interviewed Louis Pitts, and I kind of knew where to go. And I mean, those two matched up so well, like in my documentary, those two. And it's just, you're right. Like while I was editing, a lot of pieces unfolded that I just would not have seen if I just left and wait till all the footage was done. It's just, it's really difficult. But I mean, I saw you shoot so much footage. You were running around the Truth Commission, just shooting everything. And to be honest, when I saw the film, I was surprised I didn't see more of the Truth Commission. Only reason why was because all the footage that you shot. How much overall footage did you have for this project?
We shot about 200 hours, and a lot of that was, I don't think the number was quite that large, because some of that was double camera at the Truth Commission,
Right.
which I knew by definition would have a lot of, we must have shot 50 hours at the Truth Commission. And the challenge was how to have as little of that as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd filmed a lot of meetings, and, you just have to realize that a meeting generally doesn't play well on screen.
You have to find that nugget of information that they say that really works.
But there's a couple things. One is that one of the other advantages to shooting as you go or editing as you shoot, particularly in a film where there's no narration, is that you get a lot of you run into a lot of transitional roadblocks, and you have the advantage of going in knowing you need to get from this scene to that scene, and you'll need an image that'll do it, or you'll need a line from someone to reference, we're about to finish our work, whatever that kind of throw is. And to some degree, of course, that's cheating, but there's a lot of quote unquote cheating that goes on to make the story work. We did film a lot of the Truth Commission, but it seemed that I knew that there in fact ended up being more of that material in the film than I would have originally expected. I thought that it would be very little. And in my film, it's like the basic unit is really a scene, not really a soundbite. It's all built upon scenes. And there were many, many scenes that were really strong, but just didn't work. And even if there was a great line, I couldn't remove it from the context of the scene because it needed a beginning, middle, and end.
Right.
So a lot of things just have to fall away, and that's the process.
So is that how you look at your scenes? You need a beginning, middle, and end?
I wouldn't necessarily shoot it that way, but in terms of constructing it, and I'm not sure they need a beginning, middle, and end, but they certainly need one of those, or two of those, too. In terms of working with other filmmakers, someone I worked with early on was Ken Burns, and Ken was he wasn't even the director of the film. It was a multi-part series called The West, for which he was the producer, and Steve Ives was the director. And honestly, I'm not really a fan of Ken Burns' films, but I think he's brilliant, and I think he's one of the smarter guys I've ever seen in an edit room. And ironically, while my films look nothing like his, I learned a great deal from him, and I quote it all the time, that Ken's mantra in the edit room watching the film is he would say, "Where am I?" If a scene if we transition from one line to the next line, or from one scene to the next scene, and it wasn't motivated and it wasn't concluded, he would say, "Where am I?" And in a documentary where the story is not necessarily clear, and where, particularly when you don't have narration, the entire film has to have an arc, each of the three acts has to have an arc, and each of the scenes has to have their own arc. And the audience, it shouldn't be that an audience has to know, okay, now I'm going to end here and now I'm going to go to the next place. But when you get to the end of the scene, it has to feel motivated. And when you change and cut, it has to feel motivated in some way that you've earned the audience's attention to go to the next place. Otherwise, as a viewer, I get lost and I say, "Where am I?" And the "where am I" question is a really big one. And to make a film without narration, which is what most people seem to want to do in documentaries now, and I did too, and it's much more elegant for sure, and it has other advantages, but it's very difficult to do. There's a lot of challenges in terms of how to hold an audience's attention and to have them follow the story over a 60, 70, 90-minute period. So even though in Ken's case, it was on a particular kind of filmmaking that was very script-driven, which mine isn't, that lesson and that kind of mindset I definitely applied to my film and to every film I've ever worked on.
That was one of the things I wanted to talk about, was how you use no narration in the piece, and it flowed so well. And to make a film that have your characters explain what's going on and to make it a story. That's something that's very admirable, and I appreciate that. So you did a very good job on that.
Thank you. I mean, I said the advantage of not having narration is it's more elegant, and I do believe that. But on a much deeper level, the advantage is if I had the, and I like writing narration. I like that process, and I've done it for film series on PBS and other. If there is narration, I'm editorializing all the time. In making the film, there's a 1,000 editorial decisions a day about how the characters are seen, how they're reflected, how they come across. But if I have a narrator say, Nelson Johnson used to be a communist firebrand who was trying to overthrow the government, but now he's a minister who's earned the great trust of the people of Greensboro. If I say a statement like that, I'm imparting a lot of information that colors how you see him.
Right.
And I'd rather not do that. I'd rather have that come across from other people who you then have to question what they bring to the equation, why they're saying it. Because it may be true, it may not be true. If the narrator says it, the information comes across in a totally different fashion that I don't want to be the one literally to be editorializing on who these characters are. And sometimes there's conflicting information that comes across, and that's intentional. And I really do want the audience to come across, to work their way through that. It can't be something that's so confusing that they don't know what's going on. But I just didn't want to be imprinting my take on all this information, even though by editing it and by shooting it, I'm doing it anyway.
Right.
It comes across in a different way. And I mean, I'm an experienced editor, and it takes a very long time to kind of get all that material in place and to get the information working in a way so you can follow the story without all these speed bumps of, but what happened and how did that and wasn't there and I don't understand this. It's challenging, especially in a story like this where there was a lot of information you need to know. Showing it in Greensboro and actually in Durham also, where people knew the story. A lot of the questions of the Q&A were, how come you didn't include this?
Right.
And how come you didn't include that? And I just kind of chuckled to myself because the challenge was how to say as little as possible informationally so the story would just kind of be able to get all those questions out of the way. But it really is a very challenging process, and probably only someone that's ever made a film can really appreciate that. And I'm not looking to pat myself on the back, but I am well aware that if you try to say everything, that ultimately you say nothing. So the trick was how little did the audience really need to know to stay with the story? That's the challenge.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that we're trained as viewers, though, like if you just watch TV, is everything is told to you. There's really hardly any, like, you have to watch it, you have to come up with your own conclusions. And that's what I like documentary films so much, because majority of them don't use voiceover narration. And so it makes the viewer more part of the project because they have to come up with their own conclusions. But you're right, because you put together the documentary. That is your voice. Yeah, and editing and storytelling.
The film has to be entertaining, or it has to be enjoyable. I mean, and I'm talking about a case here where people were killed, and that's never going to be enjoyable, but it has to be kinetic, it has to be dynamic enough so that an audience wants to follow it. But having said that, they have to do some of the work also.
Mm-hmm.
And someone who's actually the son of one of the survivors, one of the widows, said, well, I really liked the film, but the place where they're walking and there's music and they're going to the Truth Commission, I really wanted to know where they were going. And I said, well, that's tell and show, and I really would rather do show and tell. And I think if the music is interesting and everything kind of stops for a moment and you see them walking and it's very elegant and engaging, you'll want to know where they're going, and you'll find out within 1 minute.
Exactly.
And if you tell them first where they're going to go, then I don't care that they're going there.
And
so
that's what I got from watching that. I was just like, where they're going. And then they ended up, and you know what? I didn't even know they did that, the first day. So yeah, you're right. That worked really well.
It's a very simple little difference. And in fact, I did first construct that scene where there was the meeting inside the church. We said, okay, we're going to go there and it's going to be a silent march. And I know that we all like each other and want to talk, but try not, we're going to try to have a silent march. And I thought it was necessary to hear that there was going to be a silent march. But when I removed it, nothing was lost.
Right.
And you want to be engaged in the story, but you want to kind of have to find it also as a viewer. So if you have to do too much of the work, you're going to leave the theater. But if you have to do a little bit of work and you're really interested in what's going on, then you'll be on the edge of your seat to some degree, and that's a good thing.
Could you also talk about your director of photography, Scott? He really did help. I mean, I don't know as far as how much you shot, but the overall look was very clean. It was just shot dynamically, very great cutaway scenes. It was just a really nice piece put together.
Scott Anger is a DP who shot. I found him from a number of other independent filmmakers, and he was working on, at one point, 3 different independent films that took place over time. Scheduling was really difficult because he's very busy and is often in Pakistan and Far Asia and Iraq, and it's very difficult to schedule. But he his way of telling a story and my way of seeing a story seemed to be really in sync. And Scott, it does a couple of things. Besides getting really beautiful images, he covers the scene really well. And he virtually, I would say absolutely never zooms and rarely moves the camera. And there were times when I have to ask him to move the camera, as in, give me a shot with a move, as a different way of getting into a scene. But generally shoots a lot of static shots from different points, which gives you the coverage to cut it. And I had to work over a period of time with different people because Scott wasn't always available, because the schedule was determined by my own schedule and what was going on the ground. And sometimes he wouldn't be there. And I learned a lot by working with different cameramen, which I really appreciate that effort. And Mead Hunt shot a lot of it and has a really, to my eye, different look than Scott's, but he's a storyteller, so the material works. I shot a couple of scenes on a lot of pickup shots. And the only scene that's really used in its entirety is a candlelit scene at the end of the film where after the Truth Commission, where Nelson Johnson is kind of his take on what we can all take from this, and they sing. And I shot that, and I learned a lot because I never direct Scott or Mead and say, get that shot, make sure you get this, because I'd really rather they bring what they bring, and then I talk about it broadly afterwards. But from having watched them shoot, that's how I got a little better at shooting and getting the scene. And I was personally very proud of that. And no one ever says, gee, what did you shoot? And I kind of feel like saying that shot and that shot. And
it made the cut.
Right. But if it didn't work, I would have taken it out. I didn't keep it in because I shot it, but I did enjoy that process. At the beginning, I was shooting more because I have shot a lot. But if it's difficult to direct and to edit, it's for me insane to direct, produce, and shoot. I like had a nervous breakdown almost doing it one day, and I said, "This will not." I mean, I obviously don't have money, but I there's no point in even trying to shoot by myself. It's just not going to work.
No, it by putting yourself behind the camera, it takes so much away from what you're focusing on, what you want to do next, because you could see everything, and then you can also think about what else do I need to get. You could look it around and. I'm sure you just touch Scott, like, just point, and then he'll go do it.
And he was usually there already.
Yeah.
And the other advantage of working with Scott is that because he's worked in the field a lot on his own, he also does audio, or it can manage the audio. And generally, I would do the boom, which is I would go ahead with the mic and kind of get the close-up sound, but he'd be monitoring it through the camera. And some cameramen who are seeing a scene have told me that I won't touch the sound. It's just not what I do. I don't want to have to pay attention to that. And I can appreciate that. Yeah. That's what they do. Scott has that experience. And the advantage besides financial, which is an advantage, but just as importantly, the less people that are there, the better. If you walk around, and sometimes we try not to use the boom because it makes it look, it's very imposing to have this long pole with a mic at the end that's sticking itself into a scene. So the more... the less in the way you are, the more people feel comfortable. And even on interviews, although I do like to light scenes, with Scott, we often didn't light scenes because it makes people more comfortable. It's just a little movie camera. It looks like a home movie camera, and they kind of just feel like they're talking to me.
Right.
If you set up a lot of lights, it gives it a formality, and I think interviewees kind of enter into it in that way. They feel like they're speaking for posterity, and in a case like this, I really wanted them to be more casual.
And that's a good thing with all these new cameras now. I mean, you could pretty much set up any place with low lighting and really get a decent shot. If you're looking for aesthetic purposes, it's a little different. But if you just want to get that meat, that really good interview where they feel comfortable, where they're not like the deer in the headlights. Yeah. So I saw that a lot in your film. You didn't use too much light, but I could tell with the scenes when you did.
Some of the early interviews we did a lot, and it made sense because it was. I'm not sure why it made sense. It changed over time.
Right.
And it wasn't just a question of time or of money. It really was a question of how can we get what we want.
Well, it looked like
make them feel.
Took them out of their environment, or
Absolutely.
you put them where they're talking about. I guess it opened them up.
And when I saw Greensboro's Child, it was a take on a story. And in fact, I wanted to incorporate some of Walina's story about Kwame Cannon and what happened to him. And I spent a lot of time getting that story, and I filmed Kwame's brother Kweli's wedding, and I had a lot of material about what happened to Kwame, who was arrested for breaking and entering and was sentenced to an unbelievable jail term, a jail sentence of 2 life sentences, I believe.
Yep.
Which is what your film was all about. But ultimately, it didn't fit inside my film. It required too much setup, and it was too much off point.
Yeah. I had that trouble too. Like, I felt that it really doesn't complement 79 in my piece. It ties in, and I spent probably most of the last 2 years trying to make it work. And I re-edited before I showed 79. I kind of made it chronological, and it just didn't work that way. So then it just kept molding. Finally, I was just like, this is as good as I can do, and just leave it. Just got to move on sometimes.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to structure a story, and chronology is one logical way to approach it, but it's not always the best way.
It doesn't work. I mean, it really doesn't. But to wrap things up, I want to I appreciate the hard work that you did and showing the truth behind this whole crazy situation. I wouldn't say crazy, but it happened here. You present a very important piece that I hope Greensboro embraces sometime, or just gets a chance to watch it. It's up to them to do whatever. But I think it's a very important piece of this town's history. And I'm glad that you could come in from New York, as you're saying, you felt as a carpetbagger, but it didn't feel that way because you got to know the city. You showed the city. You showed the city better than I did. And I'm from here, or I'm living here. But it really felt like a community, that these people were a part of it, and it happened here. And people need to understand that and recognize it and embrace the whole process, and hopefully they do that. So, man, thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate your work, your time, and good luck with this on the road.
Thank you so much. I hope it gets people talking. I hope it's not a question of giving them answers. It's a question of getting people to talk and to think about these things.
I love listening to these old episodes. And thanks for tuning in to Talent Freaks. I hope Adam Zucker's journey as a filmmaker and his exploration of culture and resilience left you fresh with insights and inspiration. Whether it's uncovering untold stories or creating meaningful dialogue, there's always value in sharing perspectives that challenge and connect us. To delve deeper into his work, visit his official website at longnookpictures.com. The website will be in the description in the podcast info. So don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your favorite platform. It helps others discover these stories. And for more content, visit talentfreaks.com. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and stay curious.